I was sitting in a crowded coffee shop last week, and, I couldn't help but notice this guy at the table next to me.
Yeah.
He couldn't have been older than 25. He was hunched over his phone, swiping through a dating app with an intensity that was, honestly, it was almost exhausting just to watch.
I think I know that look.
Totally. And every few seconds, he'd mutter under his breath things like, just want to meet someone normal, or, man, I'm so done with being alone. He looked genuinely driven, like he was on this high-stakes mission to find a partner before his latte went cold.
The race is on.
Exactly. Then his phone buzzed. It was a match, and I saw his face just light up for a split second, that little spark of, finally, this is it. But then something really strange happened. He stared at the notification. His thumb was just hovering over the screen, and his expression shifted from that excitement to this sudden visible wave of exhaustion.
Wow.
He didn't type a greeting. He didn't even check her profile. Instead, he just locked his phone, shoved it face down on the table, and let out this massive, audible sigh of relief.
Relief, not disappointment.
Relief. Complete relief. He leaned back, took this slow sip of his coffee, and whispered to himself, actually, thank God I don't have to talk to anyone tonight.
Whoa.
And that instantaneous flip from this frantic, desperate craving for intimacy to a total retreat back into solitude. It was jarring. He'd spent all that energy searching for a connection, only to feel this sense of victory the moment he returned to being alone.
And it turns out that's not just a personal quirk of his.
Not at all. Social researchers are now actually calling this the paperclip emotion.
The paperclip emotion?
Yeah, it's this psychological loop where you bend over backwards searching for love, only to curve right back to your starting point the moment things get real. So we're left with this core paradox. Why are people so desperate for connection, yet the actual emotional labor and the sacrifice that a real relationship demands? It just feels too great.
That paradox you just described, that perfectly encapsulates the state of modern desire, especially among younger generations. This isn't just about, being ambivalent.
Right. It feels more deliberate than that.
It's a strategic psychological retreat. We are witnessing a generation caught in this massive tug of war between the fear of loneliness and an even greater, more pragmatic fear of investing in a low-quality connection.
A low-quality connection. What does that mean exactly?
It means a relationship that demands excessive, unrewarded emotional labor. So the immediate desire for connection is very real, but the long-term cost of maintaining it is perceived as prohibitive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to really analyze the sociological forces that are driving this generational tug of war. We need to explore how these deep trends in self-actualization, these massive economic shifts, and the seductive availability of digital alternatives are just widening this gap.
Making that strategic retreat back to solitude feel like the most rational, self-protective choice. And the place we absolutely have to start is by establishing the foundation for this whole shift, which is the rising bar for commitment. And that is almost entirely driven by newfound economic independence, particularly among women in rapidly developing economies.
Right. And when we look at the East Asian context, specifically China, we see these historical social structures that kind of ironically helped pave the way for modern female economic power.
That's such a crucial insight because historically, traditional East Asian societies, they used marriage to secure social and financial networks and was very transactional.
So values like chastity and filial piety were key.
They were strongly emphasized, yes. But, and this is but unlike some other really rigid cultural systems, East Asia has this deep-rooted tradition of exogamy.
Exogamy, okay, break that down.
It's the practice of marrying outside one's extended kin group or local community.
And how did that one mechanism act as a lever for liberation, even centuries later?
Well, because you weren't strictly marrying within a tight, hyper-policed local network, the kin-based social policing, the community control over a woman's behavior and her movement, it was relatively weakened.
So the family's success didn't depend entirely on keeping daughters under lock and key within a tiny circle.
Precisely. The economic success of the family didn't hinge on maintaining absolute specific control over daughters' movements within a tight circle of related households.
So fast forward, industrialization and urbanization accelerate, economic opportunities pop up in the cities, and there's already a cultural mechanism that lets families justify sending their daughters out.
You've got it. That relative weakness of strict female seclusion allowed daughters to be, and this is a quote, dispatched to urban factories for economic opportunities. This early mobility, this independent income, it started generations ago and created a pathway toward financial autonomy that just became self-reinforcing.
And once that initial economic mobility was in place, the modern emphasis on status-conscious competitiveness just poured gasoline on the fire.
Oh, absolutely. In today's high-pressure environment, success isn't measured by domestic roles anymore. It's overwhelmingly measured by these very clear metrics. Education, career, income.
Yeah.
It's a vertical climb driven by intensive schooling.
And the outcomes are, well, the revolutionary. The data shows that 60% of young women are now enrolled in college in this context.
That is the profound success story of this cultural shift. You're seeing a move away from systems based on arranged petrolocal marriages, where the woman moves to the husband's family residence, and decisively toward genuine female economic independence.
What's so compelling to me is that this isn't just about personal ambition. It's being reinforced by the parents. They see economic success as a necessary defensive shield for their daughters.
Yes, and the rationale is startlingly pragmatic. Parents are actively supporting and even pressuring their daughters toward economic independence because they believe a husband will, quote, respect and treat a woman better if she's economically independent.
It's armor. It's a necessary tool in the marital negotiation just to ensure basic dignity and equality.
That's exactly what it is. And this independence, it fundamentally alters the dating market. It makes the standards for a partner exponentially higher.
Of course. If a woman has successfully navigated university, built her own career, enjoyed the freedom of self-sufficiency, she's not going to just trade all of that for what they call low-status, thankless domestic drudgery.
The traditional gender contract is completely broken. I mean, just consider the pressure points, like the Lunar New Year holiday.
Right.
Traditionally, that involves weeks of intense, unpaid domestic labor, often performed entirely by women under the critical gaze of their in-laws.
So for a woman who spent the last year managing budgets and business accounts, suddenly being reduced to a household servant role.
It's intolerable. It's an immediate downgrade. The cost-benefit analysis changes completely.
So marriage is no longer about economic necessity. It's not about securing status through a man. It's about choosing a highly selective partner who adds genuine emotional value.
The bar is now raised to loving companionship. Anything less than that is a net loss. It's a reduction in her self-worth and her independence. They are explicitly rejecting marriages where men might, and again this is a quote, disregard their wives' happiness.
This is the structural change that's driving the paperclip emotion from the female side.
Absolutely. When your economic survival is decoupled from marriage, the whole transaction shifts. It becomes entirely about emotional and social fulfillment. And if the market, meaning the available partners, isn't offering a high emotional return,
then the logical protective response is to retreat, to put the phone face down on the table.
Exactly. And that retreat isn't happening in some vacuum of shame either. It's actually being given social and cultural prestige.
It's a huge point. Cultural liberalization and feminist dialogue have successfully fought the historical stigma. So being single is now actively celebrated and viewed as an aspirational choice.
And this is where the digital sphere plays a massive role in validating the whole paperclip emotion. That stigmatizing old term, the leftover woman, it's being actively dismantled primarily on platforms like Xiaohongshu.
It's like a collective, highly sophisticated digital PR campaign for singlehood.
That's a great way to put it. Young women are crafting these meticulously aestheticized, living alone vlogs that showcase independence as a status marker. And these aren't just, blurry snapshots.
No, they're high-production visual narratives. They detail refined consumption, disciplined fitness routines, elegant, well-decorated apartments.
The entire goal is to make singledom aspirational. It's about showcasing a life of intellectual curiosity, self-care, and financial stability, a life that would be immediately compromised by a low-quality, high-effort relationship. This curation acts as a digital assertion that their independence is a form of elevated social status.
And the market is listening very, very intently. We're seeing brands increasingly embrace this self-focused philosophy, adopting the mantra, live for yourself. This whole cultural package validates the decision to be hyper-selective.
It makes the retreat from commitment a profitable, prestige-enhancing move. But we have to connect this newfound prestige back to the underlying reason for the retreat.
Which is?
The strategic necessity to avoid the high cost of commitment, specifically the emotional and physical labor burden, what's often called the double burden.
And we can see this exact pattern mirrored in historical economic reforms in other developing economies. It gives us a really crucial comparative context. I mean, take Vietnam after the Doi Moi economic policy was adopted back in 1986.
Right. That was a market-oriented reform intended to rapidly boost economic growth.
But while the policy was necessary for growth, it completely failed to account for these deeply entrenched social inequities.
And when you analyze its impact through, say, a decolonial and socialist feminist lens, you can see how it compromised social equity and actually reinforced patriarchy. The privatization of agriculture, the rise of multinational factories, it created waged labor for rural women, but the old cultural customs persisted,
leading to the crushing double burden. So women were now contributing significantly to waged labor in the fields or in factories, but the patriarchal customs ensured they simultaneously continued to bear the entirety of the unpaid housework and reproductive functions.
They were doing two jobs and getting paid for one.
On top of that, the policy's legal intentions were often just subverted by cultural practice, right?
All the time. For instance, land rights might be legally allotted to both men and women on paper, but the prevailing patriarchal traditions ensured that husbands usually took practical authority and control over the land's use and its proceeds.
So even though they were gaining wage labor, rural women were often placed in this incredibly economically vulnerable group. They were caught between the demands of the emerging market economy and the systemic enforcement of these conservative Confucian values that strictly fixed them within the roles of wife and mother.
And the systemic pressure, from bearing the physical brunt of factory labor to being economically compromised by relentless unpaid housework, it just demonstrates the incredibly high cost of commitment within a patriarchal structure that fails to reform alongside the economy.
So when independence offers an escape from that double burden, the retreat isn't lazy.
It's a rational defense of one's economic stability and, frankly, one's self-worth.
That structural cost, the cost of labor, that brings us neatly to the cultural realm, specifically how young women are now navigating agency, or maybe the illusion of it, within this highly feminized space online. We need to talk about the coquette culture and its psychological implications.
The coquette aesthetic it's very recognizable. It's saturated with hyperfemininity. You see lace, bows, heart shapes, lots of pinks, soft textiles. It's often viewed as a successor to, or maybe an evolution of, the earlier mid-2010s nymphet culture.
Right, which romanticized that vulnerable, passive Lolita archetype.
Exactly. And while coquette tries to distinguish itself by emphasizing emotional vulnerability and self-care rather than overt aggressive sexualization, the core mechanism, it remains pretty similar. It still fetishizes a curated, innocent form of youth and idealized femininity.
The identity is highly curated. You see these girls treating their girlhood not as some spontaneous phase of life, but as something to be, and I'm quoting here, curated, collected, and carefully documented.
And while the immediate audience might be other female niche communities online, you have to ask, who is the ultimate performance for? The ultimate documentation of this aesthetic is fundamentally aimed at securing male approval and, through that, structural power.
It becomes this sophisticated act of self-objectification. Their identity and their worth get tied to how well they conform to a perfect, traditional feminine ideal. But they do gain a certain type of power from this conformity, don't they?
Yes, but it's an illusion of power. By conforming so perfectly to the traditional idealized mold, they ingratiate themselves with men who hold the structural power, and thus they gain power over underperforming women.
So they effectively become internal agents of the patriarchy.
Policing others who might choose a messier, less conformist definition of womanhood, their agency is conditional. They gain status not by subverting the system, but by becoming its most flawless product, which reinforces the very rules that limit them.
Their currency is beauty, and they prioritize this appearance, capital above mental well-being or career advancement.
And this is deeply, deeply compounded by the influence of pop culture figures who serve as their online mentors. I mean, the early work of artists like Lana Del Rey, for example, became hugely influential because she embodied this certain brooding, vulnerable femininity that normalized passivity.
And her early music contained some deeply problematic messages that the coquette community often romanticizes. I'm thinking of albums like Born to Die or Ultraviolence.
Oh, absolutely.
Where the lyrics seem to glamorize vulnerability and just relinquishing your agency. We're talking about lines like, tell me you own me, or even romanticizing abuse with, he hurt me, but it felt like true love.
And the girls internalize songs like, I'm pretty when I cry, not as a critique of emotional dependence, but as validation. Validation that their physical beauty is their ultimate shield and their source of value.
So it tells them that no matter how chaotic or dependent their lives become, their appearance will remain their saving grace.
Which reinforces the priority of external validation above any kind of internal mental or professional self-actualization.
This cultural pattern leads us directly to the foundational philosophical critique offered by Simone de Beauvoir. She argued that women have this fundamental choice: use their freedom to reject male stereotypes of womanhood, or become complicit in their own unfreedom.
De Beauvoir laid out two states of being: immanence and transcendence. Okay? Immanence is the comfortable, passive state. It's being defined by external roles and traditional norms. You are maintaining the beautiful status quo, but it's a gilded cage. Coquette culture, with its reliance on the male gaze for validation, is trapped in immanence.
So if immanence is the beautiful, passive maintenance of the norm, what is transcendence?
Transcendence is active, it's future projecting, and it's self-defined. It means choosing your own goals, divorced from the expectations of the patriarchy. It's choosing a personal project, a difficult career path, or a complex intellectual life over simply maintaining the perfect appearance. True empowerment, she argued, requires defining femininity for oneself.
So the Coquette Girl's retreat into this hyper-curated aesthetic, while it's framed as self-love, is ultimately a way of ensuring approval from the very system that limits her. It's a retreat that maintains immanence.
Exactly. And this helps us understand why a real-life, low-quality connection is so terrifying to them. It threatens to solidify that imminent, passive, and labor-intensive role in the real world. It forces them back into the double burden of unpaid work and emotional sacrifice.
And that fear of high-cost commitment has a perfect mirror image in the perceived emotional indifference or lack of effort coming from the male side. This leads to what we're calling the emotional labor deficit.
The critique from young women is strikingly specific. They aren't just saying men are awkward, they articulate a profound charm deficit. They note that whatever emotional intelligence, or EQ, exists, it's entirely transactional.
Reserved almost exclusively for guangxi.
Yes, which is complex business or political networking. And that's a critical distinction. Guangxi is all about reciprocal favors, status gain, and hierarchy management. The emotional skills men develop in this professional context are about reading transactional signals, securing alliances, and maintaining face.
Skills that are measurable and yield immediate professional returns.
Precisely. So when a man who has mastered guangxi enters a romantic relationship, he brings that transactional mindset with him. He's looking for predictable, reciprocal actions, not the unconditional, often messy, and non-transactional emotionality required for deep intimacy.
The skills are just fundamentally incompatible.
The entire societal drive is vertical and competitive. It prioritizes status and monetary success. Because emotional management, vulnerability, sustained empathy, none of that is measurable on a balance sheet, so it's viewed as extraneous or even detrimental to status acquisition. The charm deficit is a structural side effect of an intensely competitive culture.
And what we see from the male perspective is a parallel withdrawal. It's a different version of the paperclip emotion. Reports suggest a really significant shift in male priorities. They do not want to take responsibility of family or marriage.
The calculation is so similar to the female retreat. Just planning for themselves is enough effort. They find good lives alone by prioritizing solo fulfillment, spending their disposable income on themselves, and focusing heavily on things like computer games and hobbies.
So commitment is viewed as a drag on personal leisure and financial freedom.
Exactly. So both genders are independently reaching the same conclusion. Commitment is just too costly. The woman views the domestic and emotional labor as a threat to her professional independence.
And the man views the responsibility as a burden on his personal time and financial autonomy.
And the state establishment, particularly in the East Asian context we've been discussing, it tends to just exacerbate the issue. The overwhelmingly male political establishment often struggles to recognize or address these limitations in men's capacity for emotional connection.
And they respond predictably by blaming the women.
By blaming the leftover women for being too selective or too career-focused, instead of recognizing the need for men to develop the non-transactional skills necessary to be attractive partners in this new high-standard market.
This structural blindness, it sets the stage perfectly for the true competitive threat to real-life intimacy: digital companionship.
Right. If real-life interaction demands high risk and high effort for potentially low emotional reward, the digital world offers the exact inverse: low effort for a guaranteed, controlled emotional return.
And this is where we need to look at the immense scale of this displacement. We are talking about pocket-sized dopamine dispensers that are absorbing the demand for real-world socializing on a completely unprecedented level.
The numbers are just massive. China's domestic video game market is projected to hit $45 billion in 2024. But the critical number is the platform.
73%.
73% of that market consists of mobile games. This is interaction that happens on the user's terms, often in solitude, completely bypassing the complex logistics of real-world dates.
And the technology is specifically engineered for hyper-engagement and emotional fulfillment. For women, the surge in female-targeted role-playing romance games like Love and Deep Space is providing an alternative partner that requires zero real-world emotional labor.
These are not simple passive characters. The AI companions in these games are programmed to be totally devoted. They offer instant, customized emotional reassurance. In moments of stress within the game, they don't respond with detachment. They ask, "Be careful, does it hurt?"
They provide automatic assistance in battle modes, and users can even interact physically, like touching the on-screen characters and observing these sophisticated, predictable, non-threatening reactions.
It's simulated intimacy that is perfectly controllable, non-demanding, and completely unconditional. The emotional risks inherent in real-world dating miscommunication, betrayal, disagreement are engineered right out of the experience.
This raises the core question of real versus virtual value. Are these online portals offering something that is just more charismatic, sexy, funny, and hyper-engaging than real-life partners can feasibly deliver?
If the AI character Qiyu is totally devoted, offers constant positive affirmation, and requires zero emotional labor to maintain, does the real-life counterpart just get left behind because he simply can't compete with the zero-effort devotion?
It creates a catastrophic market failure for real-life commitment. Real-life interactions require messy emotional work, communication, compromise, mutual investment, all of which carry the risk of disappointment or that double burden.
Meanwhile, the digital version is curated, predictable, and unconditionally positive. It lowers the floor for what good companionship is to zero effort, which makes real-life commitments look exorbitantly expensive by comparison.
Is this the first generation where the fantasy partner is legitimately better engineered than the real one?
That perceived cost of commitment, it extends far beyond romance. This structural retreat from emotional labor isn't an isolated phenomenon at all. It mirrors a much broader sociological trend regarding professional labor and investment.
You're saying there's a profound connection between the romantic paperclip emotion and the parallel movement in the professional world, the Great Resignation.
The fundamental psychological drivers are identical. Both are strategic responses to burnout, exhaustion, and the refusal of low-quality investments. People are refusing to invest their most precious resources, time, emotional energy, physical health, in a toxic workplace or a low-quality relationship.
The Great Resignation, which saw, 33 million resignations in 2021 alone? It's not, as some corporate discourses suggest, a function of simple laziness or younger generations just passively consuming media.
No, that whole narrative that stimulus checks eliminated the incentive to work, that is a massive oversimplification. It completely fails to grasp the underlying protest.
And workers themselves explicitly refute this idea that they're anti-effort.
They do. The anti-work movement is specifically not against effort, labor, or being productive. It's a coherent, collective protest against the exploitative economic relations and the hierarchical social relations at the workplace that are inherent in current capitalism.
They're willing to return to work,
provided the conditions improve and the effort is commensurate with the reward. The retreat, the resignation, is a calculated assertion of agency. It's a refusal of bullshit jobs that contribute nothing to society and feel meaningless or disposable.
The pandemic provided the key ingredient for this realization: forced separation.
Yes. This allowed workers to gain critical distance, realizing that work had become all-consuming and that they had the option of an alternative lifestyle emphasizing leisure and self-fulfillment.
The priorities shifted because of this newfound clarity. So, just as women are refusing the low-status domestic drudgery in marriage, workers are refusing meaningless professional drudgery.
The retreat is seen as the reasonable choice against a flawed, exploitative structure that does not promise commensurate reward.
This strategic refusal to invest in a potentially low-return structure, it applies to romantic relationships just as much as it does to the labor market. And this brings us to the critical role of structural trust in all forms of long-term commitment.
That's the key. For any long-term commitment, marriage, a career, education to be appealing, there has to be structural trust. Trust that the system will reward your effort and provide the safety net it promises.
And if that trust breaks down?
Then the rational choice is to minimize investment and seek short-term gains.
We can illustrate this principle by looking at the analysis of cultural capital in the U.S. immigrant context, particularly when examining academic achievement. The analysis looks at the assimilation trajectories of different second-generation immigrant groups.
Right. Segmented assimilation theory, which was an early model, posited that assimilation into native non-white groups led to downward assimilation, so low social and economic status, by adopting an adversarial stance toward the white mainstream.
But that theory has been critiqued for cultural determinism. It was wrongly blaming minority cultures for what were actually structural failures.
Exactly. The current scholarly view argues that success depends on a group's cultural capital and its context of reception. Asian immigrant groups, for instance, often possess strong cultural capital knowledge that helps them locate and navigate the resources in the U.S. educational system.
And cultural capital isn't just about getting high grades.
Not at all. It's about knowing the unwritten rules of the system. It's knowing that advanced tutoring must start in middle school, understanding the complex financial aid process, or effectively articulating cultural goals in college admissions interviews. This capital allows for strategic, long-term investment because the system feels navigable.
Conversely, while some Latinx or Hispanic groups possess significant social capital like strong community connections, that capital doesn't necessarily translate into effectively navigating the complex American educational system, especially if they're situated in under-resourced public school districts.
But the crucial takeaway for the paperclip emotion is the requirement of system trust. If a group feels that it is systematically disadvantaged by structural failures like systemic racism, poor educational systems, or consistent discrimination, they lose the incentive to engage in impulse control or to make those long-term, high-effort investments.
So if you are deeply skeptical about the education system as a vehicle for upward mobility, you won't invest years of effort into it. And similarly, if you don't trust the marriage system, because history shows it forces you into the double burden, you strategically retreat.
The paperclip emotion is therefore a logical protective mechanism against systemic skepticism. The strategic refusal to commit is a refusal to be betrayed by a flawed structure. It's an assertion that says, I will not commit myself fully to a structure, be it an economy, a relationship, or an educational path, if that system does not promise a reward commensurate with my effort and potential.
The retreat is agency realized. It's self-protection prioritized. So, to recap, we've covered how individual standards have risen due to independence, how the fear of emotional labor is driving both men and women away from commitment, and how digital alternatives offer this low-effort substitute.
And the core truth remains that this strategic retreat is often a calculated assertion of agency. It's a refusal to be defined by low-quality or oppressive expectations, whether those come from a partner expecting domestic drudgery or an employer demanding burnout in a meaningless job.
In that sense, modern self-actualization, it sort of forces an ethical obligation to our own personal narrative, doesn't it? We are essentially the original text, and we have to decide how faithfully we allow ourselves to be translated by all these external expectations.
That's a fascinating analogy. It's very similar to the challenges faced in literary adaptation across cultures. Consider the translation and adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula into the Turkish novel Kazakli Voyvoda.
Okay, tell me about that.
Well, the Turkish adaptation had the same basic plot and characters as Stoker's original, but the translator fundamentally altered the core theme. They imbued it with this strong undercurrent of Turkish nationalism.
How so?
They transformed Dracula into a historical enemy of the Turks and made the heroes into Turkish officers from the War of Independence.
Wow. So the change was so significant, changing the entire context and meaning of the villain and the hero, that many scholars argue it stopped being a faithful translation.
It became a separate original work. The idea, the core message of the source, was fundamentally altered to suit the new cultural and nationalistic context.
And the adaptation process raises this critical ethical question, right? Creators have creative freedom, but if the integral message of the original is changed, they have an obligation to detach themselves and market it as a new piece. They can't claim fidelity if the essence is compromised.
And when we apply this analogy back to the self, the implication is incredibly powerful. We, the original text, are constantly being adapted by external expectations, from employers demanding conformity, from partners demanding emotional labor, or from cultural norms like the coquette aesthetic demanding imminence. Self-actualization requires us to determine which parts of the self are non-negotiable.
The elements that, like the core message of a story being transculturally adapted, must not be compromised or unfaithfully modified by external expectations.
If we are to preserve the value and the integrity of the original self, and the paperclip emotion, that decision to retreat and not engage in a low-quality connection, is the ultimate act of refusing an unfaithful adaptation of one's own life narrative.